It's important to remember that John the Baptist was an extremely popular figure during his day, and his career reached a lot of people and actually had a lasting impact. He shows up in other ancient writings. We encounter some of his disciples abroad in the book of Acts. And so when officials learn that Jesus and his ministry is expanding, apparently even more so than John the Baptist, you can understand why Jesus would need to get out of town. They're going to get nervous. As popular as John was, he was also a problem. He was highly critical of the establishment and those in authority. And you don't want another movement springing up really out of what John had already been doing. Now, as one very important New Testament scholar once put it, John the Baptist had a monopoly, whereas Jesus has a franchise. If you notice, Jesus isn't baptizing anybody, his disciples are. And I think that eliminates any favoritism, so people could say, well, I was baptized by the Son of God himself. But Jesus is always interested in empowering his disciples to do the kingdom ministry in his place. So, anyway, Jesus skips town and decides to go to his old stomping grounds up in Galilee. And normally, a good, observant Jewish person would take kind of a long way around. They would cross the Jordan River and go up on the east side because you could then avoid the region known as Samaria. Jews and Samaritans did not get along. They were like oil and water if the oil was fire and the water was also fire. They hated each other. And there's a long history that feeds into that. See, in the year 722 BC, the nation of Israel, or the northern tribes of Israel, were wiped off the map by the Assyrian Empire, by an emperor named Shalmaneser V. And that's not important, but I think it's an awesome baby name if you know anybody who's expecting a son. But anyway, they came in and they waxed the northern tribes of Israel. And they had a tendency to deport a bunch of indigenous peoples that they conquer and then import a bunch of people from other areas so that nobody had a kind of ethnic identity. And then that way they would be much less likely to revolt against the empire. So the Samaritans were kind of a mix initially, at least as far as the 700s and 600s go. And they were kind of like God followers. They were children of Abraham. So they were kind of like they were Jewish, but not exactly. Like they had a Bible that was what was called the Samaritan Pentateuch, that was similar to the Pentateuch or the Torah of the Jewish people and then later Christians, but there were still some differences. And they also did not believe that the prophets from the Hebrew Bible were inspired by God. So they did not have those writings. Their Bible also did not have the histories like First Kings, Second Kings, and so on and so forth. So they were similar, but they were different. Now, none of those differences are nearly as important as the big difference, in that when you asked a Samaritan person versus a Jewish person, where is God, they would point to two different locations. The Samaritans worshiped God on Mount Gerizim, whereas the Jewish people would worship God on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And this is way deeper than disagreeing about where you're supposed to go to church. In the ancient world, if you asked where a particular god happened to be, they would actually just point to that god's particular temple. That's where the god resides, and it's just this critical, fundamental part of how they view the world. So if the Samaritans are saying, well, no, God is over there on Mount Gerizim, the Jewish people are saying, no, God is on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, they're talking about a fundamental disagreement. And to make matters worse, when the Jewish people were allowed to return from exile in Babylon, which remember, as we talked about in a previous session, they're returned from exile, but they're still in exile. But anyway, when they attempted to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, a group of Samaritans actually stood in their way. So there's a lot of very significant bad blood. So, anyway, Jesus travels through Samaria, and it's full of Samaritans, the Jews' sworn enemy, alongside the Romans and some other people as well. And he stops at Jacob's well, this really important site if you are a Samaritan. And this Jacob is the grandson of Father Abraham. He's the one who later gets renamed Israel after he gets into this wrestling match with somebody who turns out to be God. And so it sets the scene. He's in Samaria, surrounded by Samaritans. He stops at Jacob's well, which is very important if you are a Samaritan. He is apparently near Mount Gerizim. So then that leads us to the next question. What happens if he encounters an actual Samaritan?